So, my name is Medea and welcome to my Draw My Life video. Most people think I'm a monster, a heartless bitch with no soul and a taste for blood. Euripides would have you think that from his version of events, but the prat wasn't even there. The truth is much more depressing than anything he ever came up with. But I must warn you now, if you cry easily, go watch a cat video instead, because this is going to be one depressing story. Okay, you've been warned, so here we go. I was born in Colchis at the far eastern end of the Black Sea, into the wealthiest family of a wealthy land. I was born Princess Medea, daughter of King Aeetes and his queen Medea. But our family wasn't exactly conventional. My mom's parents, Oceanus and Tethys, were brother and sister. Awkward. And my dad's parents were Helios, Oceanus's nephew, and Perseus, who was my mother's sister. So I'm not really sure what that makes me, other than the product of some weird ancestral family tree. Moving along, I have an older sister, Chalciope, who was the perfect daughter in my dad's eyes. Pretty, obedient, and she never asked questions. I was the polar opposite, relatively plain, disobedient, and constantly questioning everything. My younger brother, Absyrtus, was definitely the golden child. My father was convinced that the sun shone out of his arse, and seeing as our grandfather Helios was the sun god, I suppose it probably could have been possible, genetically speaking, but it didn't. Speaking of my grandfather Helios, he was by far my favourite family member growing up, and I like to think that I was his. My earliest memories include him driving me around Colchis in his chariot drawn by his dragons. My father hated that his daughter would spend so much time riding in what should have been a war chariot, especially since his son was never invited by grandfather Helios to do so. My mother would fret that it was dangerous for a young girl to ride in chariots, especially those drawn by dragons, but I knew that her main concern was that so many of my dresses got torn and or burnt by Cuddles and Squeak. My welfare on these chariot rides was never a concern for me. I think I always knew that my grandfather would do anything in his power to keep me safe, and he had a lot of power. I showed an interest in the magical arts from a young age. My distant relative on my grandfather Helios' side, Hecate, was gathering quite a following. Rumour had it that even Zeus himself had heard of her great magical prowess, and given that I couldn't relate to any of my immediate family, I turned instead to sorcery and dedicated myself to worshipping Hecate and all things magical. Egged on, of course, by my favourite family member. My early teenage years were a lonely time. I mostly sat in my bedroom and chambers, studying sorcery and perfecting my various lotions and potions. All of this isolation made me a very cold person, I think, and I became very determined to get out of Colchis and be rid of all of those within it. I longed for my grandfather Helios to whisk me away to the heavens where he lived, but I wasn't blessed with being the sun god like he was, and my mortal ass would have plummeted to earth so fast even Hermes couldn't catch me. When I was 15, a boy the same age as Chalciope named Phrixus came from the sky on a flying golden ram. He told us that he'd had to escape the clutches of his evil stepmother, who had wanted him and his sister dead so that her own son might take the throne in Thebes. His sister had unfortunately perished on the journey, and he had nothing but the clothes on his back and his ram. My father, in his infinite greed, offered to house the young man temporarily in exchange for the golden ram and insisted that he must also marry his favourite daughter. Instantly I knew I was safe, but Chalciope, on the other hand, was less than impressed and demanded that she be allowed to remain in Colchis once Phrixus returned to Thebes. Father, not wanting his favourite princess to be unhappy, agreed. After the death of the ram, my father had the fleece harvested, and it soon overtook even his son as his most prized possession. What can I say? He was a family man to the core. The fleece was placed in the garden of Ares within Colchis and guarded by a ferocious dragon who never slept. I suppose my contempt for Colchis and all inside it, along with my cold nature and magical talent, could have been why Hera chose me to be the pawn in her next chess game, but I suppose at least I got my wish. It took me away from Colchis, almost permanently. Far away in Iolcus, King Peleus had stolen the throne from his brother Aeson, who he kept prisoner in the castle. Aeson's wife had a son, Jason, who they sent out of the castle to grow up away from the clutches of his uncle. Meanwhile, Hera had developed a deep hatred of Peleus due to the lack of sacrifices in her name in Iolcus, and so she planned that Jason would reclaim the throne and kill Peleus. Jason had returned to Iolcus at 21 to reclaim his throne, and Peleus had bluffed, saying that Jason would only sit on the throne when the fabled golden fleece was safely in Peleus' arms. It was well known that the violent King Aeetes was very protective of his fleece, and Peleus never expected mortal, unmagical Jason to return from this quest. Knowing that Jason would require help of a magical nature to do so, Hera asked Aphrodite and Eros to bewitch me so that I would fall helplessly in love with him. And I did. He arrived on the shores of Colchis when I was 20, and from the moment I laid eyes on him, Aphrodite and Eros' bewitchment took effect. My father said he would only hand over the fleece to Jason if he completed 3 tasks. Firstly, he had to tether 2 fire-breathing bulls to a plough. Secondly, he had to use the plough to sow a field with the teeth from a dragon, making a band of armed men spring from the ground. Lastly, he had to slay the armed men who were enchanted to attack their creator. Jason agreed, but I knew my father too well. Jason and I snuck away, and I told him that my father would never hand over the fleece willingly. I promised that I would help Jason get the fleece if he promised to take me away from Colchis. He swore an oath to Hecate herself that he would marry me and love me for the rest of his days. I should have called bullshit then and there, but I didn't. So Jason began preparing for his tasks, and I began preparing all of the lotions and potions I could to prevent my eternal love from being slaughtered like the helpless mortal he was. I made for him a lotion which, when applied to the skin, would prevent the fire-breathing bulls from burning him. The Colchians were impressed by Jason's bravery and success at such a feat, but one wasn't. Once the bulls were tethered to the plough, Jason sowed the dragon's teeth, and one by one the armed warriors sprung from the dirt. Jason had wanted to protect his pride by not utilizing my magical talents in this task, as he swore that fighting was what he did best. It grew clear that he was losing the battle, and so I placed an enchantment on a stone and threw it into the fray. The armed warriors began fighting each other, and one by one they fell to the ground, defeated. Jason approached my father, expecting him to hand over the fleece, but as I suspected, he instead said, "You may go and claim it." Jason nodded, and my father told him where he may find it, failing to mention the ferocious dragon that never slept. King Aeetes returned to his castle, feeling for sure that he'd won the dispute, and there was no possible way that Jason could survive the dragon. And he would have been right. I followed Jason to the Garden of Ares, where I told him of my father's plan. I handed him a sleeping potion which I'd brewed earlier that morning in case my father had changed the terms of the agreement and we were required to steal the fleece. Jason threw the bottle at the dragon and it smashed on its scaly head. Normally only needing a few drops to put a giant to sleep, the dragon fell down unconscious instantaneously. We took the fleece and ran as fast as we could to the ship before my father could stop us. Absyrtus saw us when we were preparing the ship for sail. He threatened to tell my father of our escape, and so Jason grabbed him and we took him prisoner. We were sailing happily into the sunset until we saw my father's ship following us. It became clear to us that they were gaining on us at a speed that would ensure we were caught within the day. Absyrtus said that our father would never stop until he had safely gotten both him and the fleece back from Jason and his thieves. Jason grew angry and threatened to kill Absyrtus. My judgment was fogged by the love spell upon me, and at this point I would have done anything in my power to ensure my future with the man I loved, and so I let Jason slaughter my brother. He threw him overboard piece by piece, knowing that my father would collect each portion of his body to provide his favourite child with the proper burial, and slowing down enough to allow us to escape. Once we knew we were safe from my father, I allowed myself to grieve for the loss of my family. There was no returning from this. I had allowed my younger brother to be slaughtered, betrayed my father, and jeopardized my brother's chances for a proper burial. I could never return to Colchis, never see my mother, my sister, nor my beloved temple again. Jason and I were married on the island of Corcyra on our journey back to Iolcus, and for a brief time I felt truly happy. We met with a few minor perils as we continued on our way, but after our troubles with the Golden Fleece and outrunning my father, I felt like Jason and I could do anything. We were unstoppable. Upon our arrival in Iolcus, Jason found out that Peleus had his mother and father killed whilst he was gone. He approached Peleus with the Golden Fleece and demanded that Peleus hand over the throne. Peleus declined. Jason intended to declare war on Iolcus and ransack the city with his men from the Argo, but knowing how dangerous this would be for him, and my love spell being as strong as ever, I suggested that I devise a plan using my sorcery to have Peleus killed by other means. Jason agreed. Peleus was getting old, and so I approached him, offering to rejuvenate his youth. He and his daughters were curious. I boiled a large cauldron of water, diced an old ram into 13 pieces, and threw it into the pot. I conjured a lamb, it jumped from the boiling water, and the daughters and Peleus were greatly impressed. The daughters excitedly cut up their father into 13 pieces and threw him into the pot of boiling water. When no Peleus emerged, I laughed at their horror-stricken faces. I thought that Jason would now be king for sure. For a brief moment, Jason and I were ecstatic at finally becoming king and queen of Iolcus. But along came Peleus' son, Acastus, demanding the throne. Given the people's love of their violent but victorious King Peleus, he had no trouble finding an army to drive us from the city. So we travelled south to Corinth, where we settled and had 2 boys, perfectly sculpted to look like their handsome father. Every fibre of my being was dedicated to loving and protecting my family. But Jason must have grown unhappy. I know he had longed to be king, but I was so caught up in my own synthetic happiness that I did not notice his growing unrest. After our 10th year of settled family life, I found out that the love of my life was divorcing me to marry the Princess of Corinth, Princess Glauce, daughter of King Creon. I was devastated. All of my love for Jason, fueled by the powers of Aphrodite and Eros combined, grew poisoned by hatred. As the final ounces of the love spell washed away, all of the evil I had previously committed for Jason's benefit swelled within me. The betrayal so deep of my father, who, although I had not been his favourite, had never actively mistreated me. The murder of my brother, my little brother, who had only witnessed my betrayal to our family and had ended up dying for it. The murder of Peleus, who had never met me, let alone wronged me, and the torment of his poor daughters, whom had committed a crime so great against one they loved so dearly. I could not bear to look at Jason, nor the offspring we shared, who looked so much like him. I could think of nothing but getting my revenge on the man who had so drastically turned me against my own family and people, used me for my magical prowess to further himself, and now abandoned me and our family for a younger, more socially powerful, more wealthy wife. I longed for death, thinking of creative ways to end my life. Creon wanted me exiled from the city, and my sons too, fearing that I may make my revenge against him or his daughter after what happened in Iolcus. Not wanting to lose my chance for revenge, I pleaded that he have mercy upon me and my fatherless sons, so that we might have some time to collect ourselves, gather our things, and so that I might find somewhere to stay. They allowed me 1 day. 1 day was all I needed. It so happened that King Aegeus of Athens was visiting Corinth at this precise time, and he had heard of my magical and medical knowledge. He requested that I aid him in overcoming his sterility problems so that he might have a son before he died. I agreed to come and stay with him after I left Corinth. Suddenly, I had an idea for my great revenge plan on Jason the traitorous. I found a beautiful robe and matching crown with which to gain Jason's trust. I presented them to him as a gift intended for Glauce. I told Jason that I would greatly appreciate him requesting that our sons and I might stay on in Corinth so that they may see their father. Jason bought the ruse and took the gifts to Glauce at once. Upon putting on the robe and crown, Glauce absorbed a poison so strong that she would be dead within minutes, her flesh being eaten away by invisible embers of a magical flame. Her father attempted to embrace her, hoping the poison would instead rub off on him. The both of them perished almost instantly. Part 1 of my plan was complete. All of the anger drove me temporarily insane. So bent I was on hurting Jason that I forgot every other emotion, even a mother's love. I took one of Jason's swords and ran them through the prepubescent bodies of our Jason look-alike offspring, picturing his face on each of them, which didn't take much imagination. I gathered their little corpses and angrily shouted to the sky for my grandfather to take my sons and I away to the heavens where we could be eternally free. He denied my request to die, but instead sent his chariot that I had ridden on oh so long ago to use as a way of escape. Jason was coming. I waited on the roof just long enough so that he might see that his worst fears had been realized, then let the dragons lead the chariot, myself, and my sons away. The journey would be a long one. I stopped on an island to lay my sons to rest, giving them a proper burial, and it was then when all of my true mourning began for them, and what I now considered my own wasted life pursuing Jason's dreams. Remembering my promise to King Aegeus of Athens, I flew there in the chariot after allowing myself a few days to mourn. I hoped for a fresh start with a man who could love me for providing him with a son. Before long, we were married, as Aegeus was very eager to have a son before he died, and he was already getting old. Within 1 year we had a son whom we named Medea, and he brought us both much joy, but yet again that joy was short-lived. Before too long a young man appeared in Athens, and instantly I could tell that he was a son of Aegeus, but why he had lied to me I did not know. Fear filled me, and memories of my previous betrayal by Jason were brimming. I couldn't handle any more betrayal in my lifetime, and so I again devised a plan to rid Athens of this young man. I developed a potion which Aegeus was to give the young man, Theseus, as his name turned out to be. Aegeus agreed that he would give the potion to Theseus should he feel threatened by him. But upon meeting him, he recognized the sword the young man was carrying and claimed that only a long-lost son of his would have access to his long-lost sword. All of my hope and plans for a future for Medea and myself in Athens vanished, and sure enough Theseus was made king. Medea and myself were banished from Athens in our dragon-led chariot. Once again, I was homeless. Having nowhere else to go, I found myself heading toward Colchis. I had hoped that perhaps my father, King Aeetes, would at least show his grandson some mercy if I could not escape my fatal fate. Upon my return, I found that my father's brother Perses, who was the father of my beloved Hecate, had stolen the throne from my father, who was wallowing at his newfound unkingly state. Finally, I saw a chance for myself to be forgiven for my betrayal while under the influence of the combined love spell of Aphrodite and Eros. I took it upon myself to slay Perses and restore my father to the throne. It gave me great pleasure to see my father look at me with a smile for the first time in my life. King Aeetes, as it turned out, had become a big softy in his old age, and to my extreme happiness and pride, he turned down the throne and instead gave it to Medea, my son. So as you can see, my life has not been easy. There certainly has been far more anguish than happiness, but in that moment it was all worth it. Finally my father was proud of something that could be attributed as mine, my son. Finally I felt as though I was where I belonged, where I was needed, and where I was loved. But given how quickly my life has done a complete 360 in the past, I still keep my sorcery books close, and those that can hurt me most closer.